Hi there. So this is for you as the instructor, some advice that I've been giving to some of our other instructors on how to really show not tell. And the way I describe it is sort of, you are like a detective, you're like Sherlock Holmes, and the learner is your Dr. Watson. And you are asking them thoughtful, provoking questions and asking them to, look at some code, and they can see how you change it to make it better or worse so that they can better understand how that function or how that model works. And that way they see you experimenting and iterating on the code when possible. So here's an example of it. So on the left-hand side, you want to have Markdown to have scripts for both what you want to say before you write the code and also what you want to say after you've written the code and run it. So before you start writing some code, you want to give a quick preview of what you're about to do. So for instance, we're now going to talk about max tokens. You can choose how long you want the model's output response to be. This helper function that we've written, and by the way, this is a course about Llama 2, the helper function sets max tokens to 1024 by default. A token can be a word and is usually part of a full word, and on average, a token is about 3/4 of a word. So 1024 tokens is about 768 words. Let's decrease the model's output response length by setting max tokens to 20 and see what happens. Okay, so you can see how before we type the code, we try to preface what we're about to do, and then we go ahead and do it. So we're going to say prompt is equal to, and when it's a lot of text, feel free to copy a little bit at a time. That still helps to animate things slowly for the learner. So for some context, we're asking the LLM to be our personal assistant to help us write a birthday card. And we now want to personalize it, so not just for our dear friend Andrew by name, we also want to describe things that he likes to do. He likes long walks on the beach and reading in the bookstore. And then his hobbies include reading research papers and speaking at conferences. His favorite color is light blue. And very importantly, he likes pandas. Alrighty? So now we just call the function prompt. And then you can see how it's up to you, but sometimes I think it makes more sense to write things in the order of the actual execution. So for example, you call the function, you pass in some arguments, and then you get a response that you save in the variable. So you can see how I was typing this not from left to right, but in the order of execution. So prompt response is equal to that. And then I show the part that we modify. So now we're going to say max tokens is equal to 20. Okay. And then so if we do that, you can see, okay, so now here's additional commentary. And so it's really helpful to have a script, because then when you're kind of in the moment of filming and maybe you're so busy with focusing on typing and other things that maybe it's hard to think about what you want to say, but here you'll have something to help you. So you can say, notice how setting a smaller number of tokens doesn't make the model give its complete answer more succinctly. It just stops partway through its answer. So then you can see here it just says, here's a birthday card for your dear friend Andrew, and then it just stops abruptly. Okay. Okay, so the learning objective that I want to impart on you is how you can go deeper. So we could have just stopped here and just said, by the way, almost like documentation, here's max tokens, and here's how you can adjust it and look at the result. But I want to walk you through something that's going to be a bit more work for the instructor, but usually it's also a much better learning experience for the learner, for them to see how you're kind of experimenting and almost acting like a detective. Okay, so here goes. So Llama 2 models, like any large language model, have a limit to how many tokens they can take as input, as well as output in their response. Let's give the model a really long input, in this case, some text from a children's book called The Velveteen Rabbit. You'll ask it to summarize that book for you. Okay. So from utils, import this helper function, and then now we're just going to have some code that's going to read a file. And this is not the learning objective of this course, so I'm just going to kind of quickly go over it. We're going to read in this text file. And don't worry if this doesn't look familiar to you. This is something that you could search on the web and you would find a good example for how to do this. But again, this is not the main point of this course. So now we're going to say, give me a summary of the following text in 50 words. Just adding some new line characters. And then now I'm putting in that text from the Velveteen Rabbit. 3. Okay, llama call prompt response. Okay, and so as a reminder, the helper function that we've written for this class, the max tokens is by default set to 1024. Okay, now let's see what happens. So now let's see what the response says. Okay, so now this is not text anymore, it's actually some error message. Okay, so let's read what it says. Input tokens plus max new tokens must be less than or equal to 4097. Okay, given 3974 input tokens and 1024 max new tokens, going back to talking to you as the instructor, having scripts to help you decide beforehand what you want to say and how you want to say it is really, really helpful, especially when you're in the heat of the moment in filming. So I could just read this word for word. The model doesn't give a response. Instead, it returns this error message, which says that the input tokens plus the max new tokens, which are the number of output response tokens, must be less than 4097. It further notes that there are 3974 input tokens and 1024 max new tokens, which are the output tokens. So the max new tokens refers to how many words or tokens that the model can output. So let's add these two up. So the input tokens is 3974 and the output is 1024. So we see that the total is 4998, okay, which is greater than 4097. So this is 4998 tokens, which is more than the 4097 max tokens that Llama model can handle. So for Llama 2, the sum of the input prompt plus the output response can be at most 4097 tokens. And notice how I'm phrasing a lot of these things as questions. For some context, if you're teaching a live classroom of like 20 to 30 people, you'll always have some student raising their hand and asking a question, and all the other students can benefit from hearing that question and then starting to wonder themselves, what is, how do I solve that question? How do I get the answer? So because it's just you and the learner, you can play that role of asking those interesting questions up front to get the learner to think and ask like, oh, actually, yeah, I don't know. And then they can kind of figure it out with you, okay? All right, going back to teaching. So what does this mean in practice? This means that if you have a really big input prompt, for example, like the whole book, The Velveteen Rabbit, you'd get a smaller output response. Similarly, if you ask for a long output response, then you may need to be mindful of how long your input prompt is. Okay. Let's see if we can stay within the 4097 token limit so that we can still summarize that book, The Velveteen Rabbit. We can reduce max new tokens. In our helper function, max new tokens is set to 1024 by default, but we can choose something else. Recall that the input prompt had 3974 tokens. Let's calculate 4097 minus 3974. 4097 minus 3974. Okay, so that's 123. So that means we have 123 tokens left to use for the model's response. Let's set max tokens to 123. So let's say the prompt is, oh, it's actually the same as above. The prompt is this, okay? And the response, we're gonna modify max tokens is equal to 123. So, and just a quick note, the parameter name for this helper function is max tokens. The error message was referring to it as max new tokens, but the variable name in the helper function is just max tokens. There's no new in there. Okay. So we run this, and I'll now print the response. Cool. So this works. We actually get an output response instead of an error message. Notice that since we set max tokens to 123, the output response is fairly short, limited to 123 tokens. Let's check what happens if we set the output response to be longer than 123 tokens. So for example, if you set it to 124, what happens? Let's see. So 3974 plus 124 is 4098, which is one larger than the max that this error message says is that Llama 2 is able to handle, okay? So 3974 plus 124 is 4098, which is greater than 4097. So if we were to take this same prompt and now we modify max tokens to be, instead of 123, we increase it just by 1 to 124. Let's print the response. Okay, and now we see the error message. See, input plus max new tokens must be less than or equal to 4,097. 3,974 and 124 means that it went over by 1. Okay. So you get an error message as expected. It says given 3,974 input tokens and 124 max new tokens, this exceeds the 4,097 tokens allowed for a llama model. Later in the course, you'll see a set of llama models that can handle over 20 times the token length of these llama models. Okay, so I'm stopping there as a teacher. One other thing that we're doing here is providing these hooks to encourage the learner to look forward to something in the future. So several lessons later, they're actually going to see a different llama model that can handle 100,000 token length. And instead of just waiting until that lesson to say, oh, by the way, we have another thing that can do this thing, we sort of set up the need for having this feature like early on in lesson 2 in this case. And then several lessons later, when it's appropriate to show that particular model, then we link back to and say, like, remember when we had this need for a feature, now we can actually solve that need for you, okay? All right, so thanks for watching. So the summary of what I'm trying to get across here is how you can go deeper. You can imagine that one way to teach about max tokens, a simple first iteration might be just to say, like, here's how you change the parameter and look at the result. But you can go further by really showing, like, what are the limits? By experimenting with these functions or these models, how do you test the limits to better understand what the model can and cannot do? The thing that I was trying to solve here was, how could I adjust how I call this function so that it can still summarize that textbook, The Velveteen Rabbit? Okay, thanks for watching.